Right, welcome fellow SegWeather fans to another SegWeather video. And in this video, we're going to be delving into El Nino's outlook for this winter as we are currently right now in El Nino, which I'll talk more about what that is. But it's expected to last from the rest of this year and going into the early part of 2027. And we're mainly going to be focused on the U.S. impacts in this video. We will talk a little bit about what happens outside the U.S., but mainly focused on the U.S. impacts at this time. Now, looking at what is El Nino, as many of you are probably questioning, what the heck is El Nino? What does it mean? An El Nino is usually known as the warming of the ocean waters in the Pacific Ocean, which contributes to weather disruptions around the world, such as increased drought, weather conditions for parts of the world. And looking at this map, you can see this is what El Nino looks like. As you can see, all the reds indicate areas of above average temperatures in the ocean. So looking here at the equator, you can see a dark red area, and even up here, this you can discount this as this is just not relevant, but at this time, but it's mainly focused on this area right over here in this yellow circle. Usually, if you have waters this warm, this indicates an El Nino, which is typically anything from zero point 0.5 degrees Celsius above the ocean average or higher. That indicates a threshold for an El Nino to occur. Now, if you have, let's say, the blues over here, well, if this was actually over here, that indicates usually a La Nina. But at this time, we are already in the progress of a developing budding El Nino, and unfortunately, will again have major impacts all across the world. And again, like I mentioned before, with the threshold for El Nino, usually it starts with zero point 0.5 degrees Celsius and higher. Starting with our weak El Nino events, these typically are zero point 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius, and these usually bring minimum impacts around the globe. So, not looking at significant impacts like you may see, for example, in the U.S., maybe you'll see increased drought area for a little bit before it reverts back to the normal conditions for the rest of the winter, as weak El Ninos tend to not last very long. Let's say it starts in like June, it could be dead by like November, December. It's pretty much on its way out. And in the recent years, we've had this occur with 2018, 2019, 2014 to 2015, and again in 2006, 2007. So pretty recent ones we've had in the past that didn't really contribute much to our weather, but they were still impactful in some way. And then moving down the threshold, moderate to strong El Nino events. These are usually 1 to 2 degrees Celsius above the ocean average around the equator. This leads to more noticeable and significant impacts across the globe. And our recent ones we've had that occurred were in 2023 to 2024. You may remember that one, as if you do remember how the winter was in the US, it was a pretty warm winter, mainly if you're in the northern tier of the nation, but the southern part of the nation was pretty wet. But we'll speak more about the map of the way it looks like with El Nino later. And then behind now we had the 2009 2010. That was a moderate El Nino, still pretty strong. And then the 2002 2003 one also was a pretty impactful one as well. And then we have our rare thresholds with the very strong super El Nino events, which is anything from 2 degrees Celsius and above. And these tend to bring the most severe to catastrophic impacts across the globe, which could mean an extended period of drought or very warm temperatures that last for unusual amount of time in the U.S. Or let's say we get constant storm systems moving in every 2 3 days across parts of the world. Like that's pretty much what this signifies. But unfortunately, with these type of El Ninos, they tend to bring more catastrophic impacts, as these are impacts that typically last for years, if not longer, because these El Ninos tend to leave behind quite a mark with them. And the last ones we've had, again, 2015 to 2016, you may remember that one also was a pretty significant El Nino. 1997 to 1998 also was a pretty impactful El Nino back in the late part of the 20th century. That one brought quite a bit of impacts. And then 1991 to 1992 one was our last pretty strong El Nino as well. So again, quite significant El Ninos that occurred. And looking at the graph to better outlay the past 30 years of oscillations, you can see again that 1997 to 1988 El Nino right over here, pretty strong one, and then followed that by that 2002 2003 one. But literally those years in between, again, these are years that were nowhere near El Nino standards. In fact, these are probably La Nina years, which is the opposite of El Nino. But looking down the line, 2009, 2010, we had another strong one, and then here we go, 2015, 2016, that very strong El Nino that we had, super El Nino, where temperatures were about 2.5 degrees Celsius above the average for the ocean levels in the Pacific, quite significant. And then again, her last El Nino that occurred in 2023, 2024. So again, we had quite a lot going on these last 25 years of El Nino. More intense, as you can tell. You can see how, again, 1987 we had that one, and again, the last several ones have been quite significant. Now, in terms of what El Nino winter brings to the U.S. as going to fall, well, now and going to fall, like you will know some impacts now, but winter, unfortunately, is when you feel the most impacts from El Nino, especially a very strong El Nino, as with those, they tend to bring some pretty intense impacts. As you can see here on this map, for the northern part of the nation, it's pretty warm and dry, which means that we'll see less snow systems, less intrusions of cold air in this area as Arctic jet's up here. So with that being up there, that keeps much of the northern part of the country pretty dry and warm, which is nice and pleasant for them. So instead of seeing temperatures, let's say like 10 below every now and then, it would be like 20 degrees, 30 degrees at the worst, or even 15-degree day. Can't rule that out as well. Not the worst at all. And even here in the Midwest, not too bad at all. Looking at dry conditions, still pretty mild, but I wouldn't say overly mild. Just more, you will experience some mild periods, but again, it could go back and forth with the mild temperatures at times during the winter. And then looking at the south, look at this, wet and cool across much of the south, especially around the southeast. You can see quite cool. Deep south, you're going to be dealing with that especially this winter, and that's mainly being influenced by the subtropical jet, which usually that's winds in the upper levels that are bringing moisture into these areas, and with that, unfortunately, that's going to impact much of the deep south at this time, and even parts of Florida, especially, where they're going to be feeling the effects of El Nino quite strongly, with constant systems moving through, stormy pattern overall throughout the course of the winter. And looking back at our past very strong El Ninos, we've had many in the past: the 2015 to 2016 one, 1987 to 1988, and 1991 to 1992. 1982 to 1983, and then our extended event in 1940 to 1942, and then finally the one that a lot of people may not even have heard about, the 1877 to 1878. More on this later, as this is considered one of the worst on record, and this is for a good reason. Now, looking back at our past El Nino, well, very strong El Nino from 2015 to 2016, this one did bring severe droughts to parts of Indonesia and Australia, catastrophic flooding in Peru, fueled diseases including the hantavirus and dengue fever during that El Nino, as well as, again, unfortunately, El Nino does lead to breeding grounds for disease to occur. And also along with that, heat also heavily damaged rainforests and cocoa harvest across the world, especially in Chile. And along with that, we had coral bleaching that took place, a record-breaking tropical storm season in the Pacific, especially around Mexico and in parts of I would say the Western Pacific, where they had quite significant typhoons that occurred. That happened that winter. That happened that year, that 2 year period as well. And then U.S. impacts were mainly heavy rainfall and severe flooding in California, and in and also included the southern U.S. with heavy rainfall and storms. And then the northern parts of the U.S. experienced a snowless winter and also quite a bit of drought as well. Was one of the driest winters for the northern part of the region in a while, and then also significant tornado outbreaks did occur in the southern U.S. as we had some pretty intense storms that occurred that winter. And then 1987 was similar to 2015, 2016, again with the widespread droughts and wildfires, heavy rainfall, crop failures occurred. Again, the coral reefs were pretty much affected as well. Oceanic chlorophyll is also affected and went down to very low levels, which is quite dangerous, especially during this type of event. And then the northern interior of the U.S., looking at the U.S. impact, experienced the warmest winter since 1895. So quite a warm winter, very unusual. The Gulf Coast in Florida, though, experienced some deadly tornado outbreaks during the winter. I mean, meanwhile, California was hit by, again, atmospheric rivers, which means basically heavy rainfall, flooding, and unfortunately mudslides as well. And then we have, jumping down the line to our worst El Nino on record. This one was, again, happened in the 19th century, was one of the worst ones on record, and for a good reason, because this one caused severe drought across the world. So basically take the El Nino from 2015 to 2016 and trump it up a bit. That's what it was. That's what it did. And lack of monsoon rainfall, which is bad, really bad, because without monsoon rainfall in India, which they typically see during the summer, unfortunately, it leads to drought. And that's what happened in India, where they were not getting that much rainfall, and even crop failures, mass famines, and disease outbreaks that span multiple continents. So, again, a highly trumped up version of what happened 10 years ago. This past very strong El Nino, and 50 million people end up perishing, which is literally 3 to 4% of the world population. And in looking at the U.S. didn't really have as catastrophic impacts, but still it experienced the year without winters, leading to an early spring for much of the region, including farmers being able to pave their yards in winter, which is quite unusual. And also, along with that, prairie fires also occurred in Kansas and the Dakotas, which again never usually happens in winter, and especially in those kind of areas where again it's typically cold in winter. That was not happening at all during that winter of 1877 to 1878. So pretty bad winter, but luckily we're not expecting any of this to occur with this winter, as again this was the 19th century when this happened, and back then there were no models to dictate how strong El Nino was going to occur, or even that was going to happen at all. No technology, none of that stuff to basically tell you what's going to happen down the line, which is this one was so bad because there was none of that back then. But now with technology nowadays, that would likely prevent this from occurring. And then we move on to El Nino's effects on hurricanes, as El Nino does bring some pretty strong impacts on hurricane season, especially in the Pacific, where areas like Hawaii, Western Mexico, Eastern Asia, Indonesia, all those areas are at a higher threat for strong hurricanes during the course of the summer months into the fall as well. And even again, western part, even places like Mexico, well, Mexico, probably down south, Central America, greater threat for that to occur. In the past, we've had Hurricane Patricia. 2015 was a pretty impactful hurricane, excuse me, and impacted Mexico, bringing quite a bit of flooding and even some lots of deaths as well. And also, it's one of the strongest hurricanes on record to impact the Pacific as well. And then we have Hurricane Pauline in 1887. Super Typhoon Tip also happened in 1879 during El Nino year. It was one of the deadliest typhoons on record. And even with the Atlantic, despite it seeing less hurricane activity, as you'll see in our next map later on, with I'll explain more about this later. Typically, with an El Nino, you see less impacts in the Atlantic, but even so, there were still are gaps where, let's say, activity picks up again, or we get an area that forms west of the unfavorable area for hurricanes. That could still happen. Where we have Hurricane Michael in 2018, that one occurred mainly during the weak El Nino year. That one was pretty significant. It hit the Florida coast. And then we have Hurricane Joaquin in 2015. That one did make landfall in the U.S., but that one did unfortunately capsize the boat, which ended up leading to deaths of quite a few people, unfortunately, during that year. And then Hurricane Betsy, that happened in 1965, was another impactful hurricane here in the U.S. Now, looking towards our map for Super Typhoon Tip, you can see quite an impactful hurricane as you take the U.S. and then pretty much put Typhoon Tip on it. It takes up literally almost half the U.S., which just shows how strong of a system that was. And then we have Tropical Cyclone Tracy down here. Again, nothing compared to the size of Super Typhoon Tip, which is a pretty impactful hurricane. So if this were to hit the U.S., it's pretty much gone. Now, looking at Hurricane Michael, not anywhere as big as Typhoon Tip, but still was a pretty impactful hurricane that, again, struck the Florida coast. You can see this is the map early in the morning of October 10th, 2018, as it approached the Florida coast. And looking at the map for the hurricane threat between usually I would say June to November, again the above average activity that occurs here in the western parts of Pacific, that's where we see the worst of the activity. And then in the east parts of what east of the U.S. Atlantic, below average activity. But again, it does not mean the chances are non-zero. We can get tropical storm forms, let's say here, or let's say the waters, let's say like the high pressure out here in the east, which influences the tropical storms. Pushes the system out here. That can happen too, as we can have systems hitting the east coast. Unfortunately, especially during the El Nino event, where it's less favorable down in the Bahamas, let's say, but still favorable further up north. That can still happen. Now, moving on to the new effects on snowfall, this typically does bring less chances of snowfall across the northern tier of the country, especially for areas such as North Dakota, South Dakota, where you usually see snowfall. Less chance of that this winter, and nor'easters are also less common across the East Coast, mainly due to the less favorable track with systems. I usually, with a nor'easter, for it to happen, the system needs to come from the north and combine with a system from the southern part of the U.S. to form a nor'easter. But with El Nino, with the Arctic jet being further up to the north, it will make it less of a chance for that to occur, which is a good news for the East Coast, but not non-zero, as that you still have that chance to occur, especially if El Nino weakens pretty significantly later on in the winter. And then heavy snowstorms become less frequent across the upper plains to Midwest. Good news for you guys as well, especially if you're not snow lovers, but for you are a snow lover, unfortunately, this does not bode well for you, as you will not be seeing much snow this winter. But even with El Nino, it only takes one infamous storm to make the season, which examples of that being the 2016 blizzard that occurred in January that year. This was a pretty impactful blizzard, also dubbed Winter Storm Jonas, although I like to just go by the actual name of the month and the blizzard because it makes more sense this way. But again, it was a pretty impactful blizzard. And then we have the President's Day blizzard of 2003. That one lasted for a couple of days. And then the storm of the century, believe it or not, happened during the El Nino year in March 1993. Now, looking at the map for 2016 storm, you can see quite impactful from as far west as Kentucky up towards the northeast, up to about 36 inches of snowfall occurred, especially around here in parts of looks like West Virginia into Maryland. Quite an impactful snowstorm for them. Then we have the President's Day snowstorm, also was pretty impactful. Same, almost the same areas except pushed to the north. Up to 30 inches of snowfall or greater occurred around here in the same areas that are impacted by that 2016 blizzard. And in the storm of the century, pretty impactful. The map's kind of off the chart, but the area up here in the red, that those areas saw up to 50 inches of snowfall during the system. So one of the most impactful storm systems to hit the U.S. during that time frame. And usually the snowfall threat in winter, it's typically a lot lower for much of the north into the Midwest. You guys will have less chance of seeing snowfall. Does not mean it's going to be zero. You just have less chances of seeing some significant snowfall this winter. But the South, unfortunately, you guys have a better chance. So if you're not a snow lover, well, many people in the South don't usually see. You guys don't usually see a lot of snow, but unfortunately, with El Nino, it does bring a lot more snowfall, especially to Appalachian. So you guys want to watch out this winter. I would probably upgrade this to high risk, but according to again the past data, this highlight this only under moderate risk, so higher chance, and also higher chance out here for California, stretching towards Kansas and Oklahoma, higher chance for snowfall, especially the bullseye over New Mexico and California, and greater chance for some heavy snowfall this winter, and then a slight chance elsewhere. Even Texas, you're not safe. Northern Florida, probably not safe as well, as again, we get one sudden tracking system that brings in a lot of cold air with it. That can very well happen throughout the course of the winter. And now we move on to severe weather, which is another big impact of El Nino, as typically with El Nino does bring a better chance for severe weather events, especially in December and again in February, is what we've typically seen with these past events. And then Florida, unfortunately, you guys are underneath the greater threat for that to occur, as unfortunately with El Nino does highly favor that area for greater severe weather potential. And even deep south, you're also not safe. A moderate risk for severe weather potential throughout the course of the winter as well. And you can looking at past weather events. We've had the Christmas week tornado outbreaks of December 2015 that occurred, and then the Florida tornado outbreak of 1988 in February. That one was also pretty significant. One of the deadliest outbreaks in Florida at the time as well. And then we have our Christmas tornado outbreak, believe it or not, again in 1982. So Christmas not looking good for seeing this stuff to occur. And looking back at the tracks of these storm systems, this is the 2015 storm system with Christmas week, back-to-back systems. This area over here is affiliated with the December 23rd outbreak, as the December 23rd outbreak was more far-reaching to the north, bringing tornadoes as far north as even Illinois, Indiana, into parts of even West Virginia. It was a quite impactful system. And then this area over here was impacted by the following outbreak the following week, and also a significant outbreak. It heavily impacted Dallas. You can see the EF4 bypassing Dallas in that red. That red indicates in EF4. Also, again, you see the EF4 here. This is from the December 23rd outbreak. So pretty impactful system. It led to 26 deaths and also over 700 injuries. So quite a tragic system. And then the Florida outbreak of 1988 was also pretty bad for Florida. 42 deaths occurred, 259 injuries, mainly from these EF3 tornadoes. You can see the oranges that indicate where they hit around Orlando. These tornadoes alone were responsible for most of the deaths, unfortunately, with this system. And then the Christmas outbreak of 1982, not as deadly, but still was pretty impactful. We had one EF4, long tracking EF4 that occurred from northern Arkansas to southern Missouri, and then several more strong tornadoes that occurred elsewhere throughout the course of the region, but still didn't impact much of the Ozarks with this system. And usually severe weather throughout the course of the winter, looking at that severe threat with compiling all our past strong El Ninos, it does heavily favor Florida. So again, Florida, like I mentioned before, higher threat for severe weather for you guys, moderate threat from eastern Texas going up north towards Missouri, down south towards North Carolina, and then again, much of the area will be dealing with a moderate threat. And then a slight threat, not looking at a greater chance, but still a chance that we could get maybe one outbreak, maybe even two, reaching as far north as Wisconsin, Indiana, and again West Virginia, even New Jersey, southern New Jersey. You guys may have a chance of that occurring. And in West Coast California, this is mainly due to that atmospheric river bringing heavy rainfall to you guys throughout the course of the winter. Now, as we head towards the winter of 2026 to 2027, looking at quite a bit of action going on, especially across the US, looking at a southern tracking storm system as we head throughout the course of the winter, especially with snowstorms impacting southern plains to the mid Atlantic, looking at a higher threat for that occurring. The southwest will have a threat too, but looking at mainly at some pesky snow showers ongoing for much of the winter throughout much of December, January, and February, and even to March as well. We could see that occur with this pattern. And along with that, looking at less Arctic intrusions as we head throughout the course of the winter, especially as we head into December and February. But with January, that's the mystery month, as with our previous strong El Ninos, especially 2023 to 2024, and even with the 2015 to 2016 El Nino, they did bring some colder outbreaks in January. And I do think we could see that happen again this winter, especially with how the models are looking, showing December quite warm, but January is showing a pullback in the warmth with some cool air flowing in. Could linger into February, but eyeing January very closely for that to occur according to the winter time frame. And along with that, looking at heavy rainfall events impacting the southern tier of the nation, lots of rainfall, some severe weather episodes from the deep south to the southeast as well. Even Arkansas, you're not safe. We could see again an increase in severe weather, and even maybe one event possible in the Midwest at some point during winter, probably either December, or we could see that in February, depending upon again how things go with this particular strong El Nino. But again, there's a very chance that could happen, especially again December and again in February. And then looking at the record-breaking mild temperatures potentially possible from the Pacific Northwest to parts of the Midwest as we head throughout the course of the winter, especially looking at December, that can happen. February could see another possible potential of that occurring as well. January, maybe a period of mild temperatures, but it will be lesser as we'll have been watching that Arctic outbreak potential in that month. Now, looking ahead towards our analog data, looking at 1940 to 2016, this is the analog data of all our strong El Nino years. You can see that it does favor anywhere in the yellow, orange, and reds. That's where you can see the above average temperature potential. At least this is what happened from 1940 to 2016. You can see this is very much the setup that occurred where we had the very strong warm temperature anomaly over parts of the upper Pacific Northwest towards parts of the Midwest as well. Even parts of the Northeast saw some mild temperatures as well in some of these winters. The Deep South, though, fairly average, it looks like, according to these analog data, and then some rainfall potential that increased rainfall potential that occurred here in Florida and even parts of the Southwest around here in New Mexico. And looking at our winter overall, this winter does show that we'll definitely have above average anomalies across much of the North for pretty much the entire time frame of December through February. Although this model does push it towards the east a little bit more, I do think it will move back towards the west potentially as we have throughout winter, as I don't think that Northeast is going to get all warm throughout the winter. I think there'll be, again, maybe they'll see warm temperature anomaly increase in December, but the rest of winter not so much. But definitely the Midwest increased warm temperatures, and I do agree that the North will definitely see a very warm winter overall. But then deep South again, and parts of the Southwest definitely a cooler than average winter due to that rainfall, increased rainfall threat as we head throughout the course of the winter, especially when we get towards, again, December, maybe another uptick in February. And then looking at our analogs for precipitation, speaking of that, that increased above average rainfall anomaly from pretty much the Pacific Northwest around, looks like western Washington down to California, another increase, southern Arizona, and then from Texas stretching all the way towards Florida, increased anomalies for above average rainfall throughout that entire time frame. And then look at the Midwest, it doesn't show much of an anomaly, which is interesting, especially with this El Nino, the strong El Nino coming in. But according to our previous strong El Ninos in the past, with again the last 75 or so years, it does seem to show that or indicate that there's a lower chance of rainfall, lower chance for some rain and snowfall that did occur here in parts of, I'll say, the Ohio Valley and even parts up here in portions of the Pacific Northwest. So looking at a low chance, at least according to what this model says, but I do think, again, we'll definitely have some dry normal anomalies that could stretch out here towards parts of Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, definitely all of Indiana for sure throughout the course of the winter. And looking at what the CFS precipitation model is showing for this winter, it does show drier than average temperatures. Drier than average precipitation across the Pacific Northwest, which I do agree with. That's most likely going to happen. Now, here in the Midwest is the question mark, as it does show some area up here around the Great Lakes, but Midwest, it does keep it quite average, as we could. As this indicate, we could see some fluctuations where we will definitely start off dry, but then towards the end of winter, we'll get pretty wet. But that depends on how this El Nino does play out. As let's say the El Nino does crash in like late December and January, that could definitely bring these weather anomalies up towards parts of the Midwest. But I do think that much winter will definitely be drier than average up here in parts of the Midwest before we do see an uptake, maybe towards about March or so. But definitely wetter than average south as it does indicate, and also wetter than average southeast up towards northeast, quite wet, especially Florida, the bullseye for all that rainfall, and even parts here. The plains as well can see an increased rainfall amount. So looking at quite a wet winter overall, just in general. Now, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for staying tuned into this update and just bearing with me through this entire video. Again, it was definitely pretty wordy, well researched thing I was just doing the last couple weeks. But we'll definitely be back with more videos as we head into this week as we start up our actual channel. But again, thank you so much for the time was listening through this update. If you enjoyed this material, don't forget to leave a like. And if you want to hear more about this content, you can also subscribe to get updated on the latest videos on this channel. Now, in the meantime, though, stay weather aware and safe.